It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome Nicolas Glumineau, as I said, the Director General and head winemaker of Pichon Lalande since he came on board in 2012 from another second growth chateau, Montrose, just a little bit further up the road, to take us through these wonderful wines and to tell us all about this chateau. Please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you at Pichon. So it's a new kind of exercise to chat about and to promote the winery and the wine virtually, I must say. But well, we have to adapt ourselves, and that's what I try to. And I must tell you that I still feel very impressed to be in charge of Pichon-Comtesse. Pichon-Longueville Comtesse de Lalande, probably the longest name for a winery in Bordeaux ever. So that's why we shorten it into Pichon-Lalande or Pichon-Comtesse. That depends on your preferences. And well, if you don't mind, tonight I'm gonna give you a few figures about Pichon-Comtesse, her history, and maybe to explain what kind of new chapter we are writing, where we come from and where we want to go, because everything makes sense, a lot of sense, and this very family story is very interesting, because it can give you or give us the meaning of being in charge of such a long time history company, because we are just a brick or a stone in a wall, you know, and I'm very conscious that Pichon-Comtesse will remain after myself. So if we are back and talking about the history of Pichon-Comtesse, we think that the first vines planted in the area have been planted during the Middle Age. So obviously it's a long history. I'm going to try to make it shorter, but more officially, well, you all know, maybe I should start with this. You all know that we are located in southwest of France, and Bordeaux, the city of Bordeaux, is crossed by the river coming from the Pyrenees Mountains in the south of France. So crossing the city of Bordeaux from southeast to the northwest and flowing to the Atlantic Ocean. So that means that in Bordeaux, you have three main regions in terms of wine growing. The south of Bordeaux with Pessac, Léognan, and the Grave. Think of Aubryon, Domaine de Chevalier, Aubailly, Smith, Olafite, and so on. The south of the south with the sweet white wines, you know, Sauternes and Barsac. That's the first main region. Then the right bank of the river, whose soils are made of clay and chalk, so on which you have a lot of Merlot that have been planted, and also some Cabernet Franc. So now we are talking about two main appellations, which are Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. And the left bank of the river, and so meaning from south, so Bordeaux city to north, four main appellations from south to north, which are Margaux, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, where Pichon-Comtesse stands, and Saint-Estèphe. And basically, let's say that the more north you drive and the more gravelly, draining and dry are the soils. So the consequence of this very point is that the more north you drive, and basically the more Cap Sauv you have in the vineyard, and the amount of Cap Sauv is increasing as you drive north. But for any reason, the story of Pichon-Comtesse have often been related to its high proportion of Merlot planted in its vineyard. That means that, and then I'm back to the history of Pichon. Until 1850, there was only one Pichon-Longueville. And the Baron de Pichon-Longueville, just before dying in 1850, decided to share its vineyard between his two sons, who were Baron by birth. And it's Pichon Baron, Pichon-Longueville Baron. And his three daughters, one of the three daughters decided to assume the vine growing of her part and the winemaking. She married the Comte de Lalande and became the Comtesse de Lalande. And she also assumed a different label, Pichon-Longueville, her birth name, Comtesse de Lalande, her name as a married woman. So that was in 1850, 50-something, before the classification of 1855. But that was very modern at that time, you can imagine. So that's a very serious point. And in 1855, the two Pichons have been classified second growth, but the ownership since then is completely separated between Pichon Baron and Pichon Comtesse. A few decades later, her descendant, the descendant of the Comtesse, sold the winery to Bordelais family, the May. May is their name. And the May have owned, they were wine merchants, and they have owned also many vineyards and wineries. And each vineyard they have owned, they have planted a lot of Merlot in them, on them. The good story is because they have a very specific taste for Merlot. I think the truth is that in the 20th century, we were not talking about global warming, and the wines were not priced as high as they are today. Let's be frank. And I think that the more Merlot you have, the more juice you have. And so the more wine you produce, because the Merlot is genetically more generous than Cab. And it's also more generous in terms of sugar. So in terms of alcohol too, by fermentation. So the more Merlot you have, the more wine you can sell, and the less you need to chaptalize the must, because you already have enough sugar in your must. So I think that for economical reasons, the more Merlot you have, the more profitable is your business. At that time, when we were much more talking about farming than luxury. Mm-hmm. So that was the time, and that was a few generations ago. But what I want what I try to tell you is that despite of the location of Pichon-Comtesse in Pauillac, where we were supposed to have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon planted in our vineyard, we had not more Merlot than Cab, but a very large proportion of Merlot planted, until we have had until 40% of Merlot as a proportion in the vineyard, which was more than the neighbors next door. And on top of this very fact, one of the May descendants, Madame de Lencquesaing, she's a lady, she's a woman who managed Pichon-Comtesse between 1978 and 2006. She has promoted Pichon-Comtesse in a tremendous way. She's a lady. It's more Merlot than the neighbors, and Merlot is famous for producing more, let's say, charming, fleshy, aromatic wines. It's La Comtesse versus Le Baron. Everything was done in order to promote a very feminine touch, a very feminine approach of the winemaking at Pichon-Comtesse. So it was kind of very obvious marketing. And that was all about Pichon-Comtesse. And I must confess, all the wines made under the direction of Madame de Lencquesaing, let's think of the 80s that were very famous for Pichon-Comtesse. 82 is very famous because it's a 3 figures points wine, but not only 82, 83 is tremendous, 85, 86, 89, such a series of fantastic vintages, fantastic wines made at that time. So the global image of Pichon-Comtesse was an image of great wines, of beautiful chateau, beautiful proportions, everything in balance, and an image, an icon of femininity and so on. When Madame de Lencquesaing decided to sell the winery, she sold it to the Champagne Louis Roederer house, which is a family, which is run by a family, the famille Rouzaud. It's a French family. That means that after centuries, the story of Pichon-Comtesse has always been related to families. So it's not unique, but it's rare enough to be mentioned. It's a family business today. And the Rouzaud, they are winemakers. They are very involved into that kind of businesses in Champagne, in Côte du Rhône, in Portugal, in the southeast of France, and now in California. So they are a lot into winemaking. And one of the first questions that the Rouzaud asked when they joined Pichon-Comtesse was, do you have a soil map of the vineyard? Just to check. We do have under our feet soil and undersoil. And this map did not exist at that time, I must say, because I was in charge of Montrose a few years before. We have done the same between 2007 and 2009. It's something, you know, we were used to replace foot by foot when one of those feet was dead. We were used to replace. So once you have those proportions and that kind of grapes on that kind of plot, you just need to replace foot by foot. So it's a kind of habit. The proportions were not that used to change generation after generation. To the contrary, they were always the same. Today we don't run the same politics and the same strategy. It took a few years before getting this soil and undersoil map, and the game was to try to match soil map with the proportions of each grape on each plot, just to check if Merlot were planted, Merlot that were very famous at Pichon-Comtesse. The question was, are those Merlot planted at the right place? Or differently asked, on that kind of soil, shall we still plant some Merlot, or shall we switch to Cab? And actually, that was the best way to figure out that probably we can things evolving a bit. And that's why since 2010, we run a replanting program step by step. We pull out 3 hectares of vine every year. So we own almost 100 hectares. So we pull out 3 hectares of vine every year. We switch, we let the soils having a rest during 2 to 3 years. So we run fallow plots during 3 years. And then we replant with the right grapes, right roots and right grapes at the right place. So finally, from, let's say, 50 Cabernet Sauvignon, 40 Merlot, 7 Cab Franc, and 3 Petit Verdot, we're gonna evolve to 70 Cabernet Sauvignon, 65 to 70, 25 to 30 Merlot, and still 5 to 10 of Cab Franc and Petit Verdot. So it's a very long-term strategy. And this replanting program, we have started it more than 10 years ago, and it gonna last 10 to 15 more years.
And
that's the best example to testify that everything we do now, we are doing now, is done for the next generations.
Absolutely. And in the process of the soil mapping that you have done, it appears that you have established certain parcels which will always go into the Grand Vin, and then perhaps these parcels that are up near Bataille and bordered by some of the plots owned by Latour, which go into the second wine, or the Reserve de la Comtesse, of which we have our 2 examples. So perhaps we could turn and talk a little bit about this this second wine. Are you comfortable with the term second wine, for starters? And you can lead us through the 14 and 16 vintages together. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we have no specific vineyard dedicated to Pichon or to Reserve. So that means that maybe someday, that's what I'm used to tell to my technical team, someday we'll make 100% Pichon and no Reserve at all. I mean, it won't occur, but it just the fact that we want to apply to each plot the best recipe to try to help it to reveal itself the best way. And that's the goal we want to reach. And what is for sure is that we have one plot, what kind of recipe, agronomic recipe and work. We vinify each plot separately. And finally, our blending sessions after the winemaking process, our blending sessions, the first sessions, we run them completely blind. I just don't want to know where the wines come from. So we have 60, 70 different wines, 60, 70 different stocks on them. And we only have 60 to 70 different wines. And we do our selection. I think that the best way to give each wine its chance or not. I'm okay with the name of second label, because I mean, we have to name it, and we have to do the difference between both first and second label. But what is for sure is that all the efforts we do to make the first label improving, the second label takes the benefit of everything. So at the end, I think it's such a value for money. The second label, Reserve de Pichon-Comtesse. We are very proud of it, and we have to be proud of it. I mean, it's not only marketing, because the name is written on the label, but I mean, my job is to make decent wines. Yeah. And my passion is in making great wines. So even if it's the second label it has to be it has to be good. And finally, it's a price. We have to admit it's not exactly cheap, and it's not for free. So we have to be very we have to be proud, and it's all about the dignity. We have to make that kind of wines. 2014 Reserve, I think it's very good, very balanced, a good pupil, you know. Nothing on top, could have been a bit more extracted, but that was the first vintage we vinified in our new cuvée. So I can very well remember it was all about testing new pumps, new tanks, everything was new. So we did not dare pushing too far anything in terms of extraction, in terms of tannic structure. So that's why finally it's a very balanced wine. I think it's very good. 16 for sure is a year that was carried out by the power of the vintage, and we were more comfortable with extracting the wine a bit more to give it more shoulders. But that's the other goal I want to reach at Pichon. Using more cab than in the past, in a recent past, but making a true Pauillac wine, which is still and always Pichon-Comtesse, which what makes Pichon-Comtesse different than Lascaz, Latour, Pichon-Baron. Yeah. Pichon-Comtesse is all about the flesh, the racy approach of the aromatic structure, the aromatic complexity. So more cab, but still Pichon-Comtesse. That's the balance. And I think that the Reserve is a first step to that kind of balance between the freshness of fruit, the flesh of the wine, but a serious structure, which is all about Pauillac and cab.
And fascinating. And I wrote down here earlier that with regard or respect to the 2014 Reserve, Antonio Goloni referred to it as, you know, perhaps Bordeaux's most polished second wine. And in the 14, I believe the blend was 59% Cabernet Sauvignon and 41% Merlot. So no Cabernet Franc and no Petit Verdot. And yet in the 16, all of the Petit Verdot that you grew that year actually went into the Reserve wine. And so none went into the Grand Vin. What was the reasoning behind that?
Your question is very, very interesting, because it's all about the future of Petit Verdot. The Petit Verdot is very difficult to grow. It's very tough to grow. It's a very fragile variety, fragile to high winds, to strong wind, to strong rain, to diseases. And it's sometimes difficult to get its perfect ripeness. So it's a lot of work for an inconsistent result. But on top, even if it's very good, sometimes its aromatic power. Petit Verdot is all about black cocoa, dark cocoa. It's all about blackberry, white pepper. White pepper is very specific, very, very special aromatically. That sometimes it can disbalance the final blend of Pichon. In 2016, I can very well remember, we first, after our blending sessions, we had our selection of Cabernet Sauvignon, then our selection of Merlot that we blended together, then the Cab Franc, then the press wines. And we finally decided to add a few sips of Petit Verdot. We started with 2% of Petit Verdot, way too much. So let's try 1%, and then 0.5%. And we decreased the amount of Petit Verdot to 0.1% of the final blend. I was convinced that no way, we won't use it. But it's my palate. I'm not alone to decide. I mean, sometimes you need, every time, always you need someone to confirm or not what you feel, because it's all about the sensations. And then we decided to run a triangular blind tasting. And we asked everyone to run this tasting. The people working for the administration, the people working for the service, everyone, just taste, try to find the different wine. And if you find it, is it better or not? 100% of the people tasting the wine with this sip of Petit Verdot tasted it less good than the other one. So we were right. And so finally we did not use it. In 14, that was a bit different. 14 is not that powerful vintage as 16 is. And the Petit Verdot was useful to give more mid-palate and shoulders to the wine. That's why it acted like a press wine. It gives flesh to the mid-palate. So that's what we use it in 14 and not in 16. But I must say that it's now a few years in a row that we don't use it anymore for Pichon.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. It'd be great to see people's comments in the chat about the difference between those two reserve wines. Love to see whether you, for now, prefer the 14 or the 16. I think that the addition of the Petit Verdot in the reserve of the 16 is certainly makes it a fascinating wine. It has to be said. Before we move on to our first pair of the Grand Vin, which, just because, sorry, I think there was a little confusion beforehand, apologies. If you haven't seen in the chat, we will be doing the 9 and the 10 next. So we'll be going from mature up to youth and power. Martin just commented here, what about the Cabernet Franc? So that is a grape that we haven't discussed. Perhaps as we move into these first two vintages, the 9 and the 10, given that the 9 has no Cabernet Franc, I believe, and the 10 does, perhaps we could launch off the explanation of the Grand Vin with a little mention of Cabernet Franc, please.
Okay, so well, I love Cabernet Franc. First, I think it has something very racy, elegant, straight, sharp, noble. And on top of everything, considering the climate change, it gives the freshness. It adds some freshness. It has a style, and it adds something to a blend that I really appreciate in terms of direction of the wine. I was saying a few minutes ago that describing a wine like an arrow or a skeleton, an arrow with a scarf all around, or a skeleton with flesh around. And Cabernet Franc is both part of the skeleton or the arrow, but it makes the link between the arrow of tannins due to Cab and the scarf of cashmere and flesh due to Merlot. Cab Franc is this this part of the wine which is between Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, and it adds something to the directions we try to give to the wine, and that's probably why also I mean, you can compare 2009 and 2010, and we will during decades, like we have compared 82 and 83, or 85 and 86, or 95 and 96. 2009, 2010, we'll compare them during a very long time. I'm more 10 than 9. 9 is, but it's my personal taste. I mean, the inner quality is almost the same, but 09 is very grandiloquent, very opulent, when 10 is quite austere. It's the Cistercian wine, straight, sharp. It goes, you know where the target is, bam, it goes there, no doubt. And you can't avoid the tannins, but tannins that are made to last 50 years. And I really appreciate this approach of wine. As you mentioned it, I joined Pichon-Comtesse in 2012. So I was at Rose in 09 and 10, and I can very well remember the 10 at Morose. I was so excited to make this wine. I love it. And the Cap Franc, to me, is the approach or the conception of the Cap Franc is closer to the style of the 10 than the style of the 09, which is probably closer to Merlot and the flesh of Merlot.
Yeah, it's fascinating trying these two vintages together, you know, both legendary vintages and both very different. And perhaps I would venture, although it was before your tenure as Director General of the Chateau, it shows the two faces of the Chateau. You do have this flamboyant, sensual richness of the 2009 that has a lot of flesh and a lot of emotional impact. And then the 2010, whether it's austere for some or just a little more strict for others, there's a wonderful classicism to the wine. It's not that it loses sensuality, but it's a little bit more intellectual. And I wonder if the difference lies in that, the cepage, the fact that the 09 in this instance is 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, but the 10 has, for me, what seems like quite a low percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, given the direction you're taking the Chateau, at only 66%. Do you think it's that which has a difference, or is it more the style of the vintage?
No, I think that was the very start of our strategy. So I bet that we wouldn't have made it the same today, for instance. And I give you a clue. I mean, 2020 that we have blended 2 months ago is 77 Cabernet Sauvignon. It's 100% Pichon, but it's 77. It's 77 Cabernet Sauvignon, 17 Merlot, and 6 Cabernet Franc. I think, but it's a question of taking time to move things step by step, and I think that it's always easier to make the history again. But I guess that today we would have used more caps off than in 10.
And as a little aside, you know, before we carry on to the next pair, and if anyone's got any comments, again, please use the chat. But am I right in thinking in 2013, which was a very tricky vintage, was that the year that you used 100% Cabernet Sauvignon? Was that right? That's pretty crazy.
Thank you for asking. That was my first entire Pichon-Comtesse. You know, in 12, I joined Pichon in 12, but in November of 2012. So that was my first blend, but I did not run the harvest and so on. But 13 was my first global vintage. And okay, so it was very tough. And the truth is that late September, early October, we had very humid, a lot of rain, a lot of very high rate of humidity, and very, very warm nights. I mean, something like 20 degrees Celsius plus. And the rot started to run through the vineyard. And at the end, we decided not to use the Merlot because we had just a poor, very low yields in terms of production of Merlot, and the caps were good, and we could save them. So at the end, we just produced the fifth of a usual crop, of an average crop, and that's why we selected. We decided to make 100% Pichon, 100% caps of Pichon. Well, at the end, I'm pretty happy with it because it's very expressive, very aromatic, and you couldn't bet it's you couldn't guess it's 100% cab, but it is. But that was a decision very difficult to take. That was difficult to age in barrel because the wine was fragile. We could taste that it was fragile, so we decided not to rack it every 3 months as usual, but with a lower frequency. It was also difficult to assume in front of journalists, distributors, wine lovers. You know, this winery, which is famous for having more Merlot than the neighbors, the newcomer decides to make 100% cab. I'll let you imagine. So it's a question of the largeness of the shoulders.
Yeah, they must have thought
a big costume.
They must have thought, if that's what you do in 2013, you're going to make 2014 120% Cabernet, and you'll be taking their grapes. So, you know, I can't worry.
Exactly.
Well, fascinating. I think moving on to our next pair, the 16 and the 18. Before we do, or as we do, I know personally, you know, as a merchant and as a, you know, sometime commentator on vintages, I get a bit lazy. Because I tend to make the same comparison between 09 and 10, the vintages we just tried, and 15 and 16. Now, we're not trying 15 this evening, but could you kind of briefly explain why that is maybe incorrect? Why, you know, 9 is not the same as 15 and 10 is not the same as 16?
It's a difficult explanation to give, but I think that 16 is much more a compromise between 09 and 10. And finally, that's probably why 16 is such a complete vintage.
Okay. Yeah.
Since the very start, I mean, it has something which is all about the sharpness, the uprightness of 10. It's a wine that doesn't move. You can try to push it, it won't move. It's a block made to last decades long. But it has something about 2009, which is all about the aromatic expression of the wine. You don't need to wait 25 years before this wine, this 16, has to give something, has to express something. So, and that's your question is all about the question that we really have every year. To what former vintages could you compare the new one? Is it fair? Is it fair to compare 2019 or 2010 with 1989? It's not a question of fair or unfair. It's today, I try to think that 89 in its earliest days probably tasted like this, but I just don't know. I mean, I was born in 1974. So I just don't know how the 89 tasted. I can remember, it's a true story. Someone emailed me from Canada years ago to ask me how was the 1961 en primeur. He asked it to me. Okay, I have some gray hair, but and my answer was, I don't know. What I do know is that 1861 tasted very good. So it's always difficult to compare old and younger vintages. It's a perception of wine, but it's part, more seriously, it's part of our culture that we just can't learn in books during studies. We just can't study. It's all about tasting and tasting and tasting again. 15 on the left bank was very, very fleshy, very expressive, but something almost unique, probably tasting like 2003. But comparing 15 and 16 makes no sense to me. Makes no sense, because the inner quality on the left bank, once again, on the left bank, the inner quality of 15 and 16 is way different. When you can try to compare 09 and 10, when it will make sense to compare 2019 and 2020, for sure. 19 and 20, yes, that makes sense to try to compare them. They are maybe not twins, but not so far.
Absolutely fascinating, and I asked a complex question, and you gave a complex answer, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure, and I certainly hope.
I hope this because of my English, I hope that everything.
No. It was entirely explicable, and we have it recorded as well, so I can go back through it too. But so we've got this wonderful pair of 2016 and 2018 now, and a few comments from others, which I thought were worth noting here. Again, back to Antonio Galoni, who did award the 16 100 points, made this interesting comment saying, whilst the 2015 is a soloist, the 2016 is an orchestra. I thought that's a really interesting comment, in fact. And this is perhaps the best vintage that you have overseen in your tenure so far, said Neil Martin. Meanwhile, Jeff Leave, Wine Cellar Insider, said this is the best vintage of Pichon since 1982. On the 2018, again sticking with Jeff, said that this was a modern day version of 1982, so possibly even better than the 16. And clearly, for those of us who have the wines in our glass, this is a truly epic compare and contrast. Neither wine, well, in fact, rather both wines, you would like to have an awful lot of in your cellars, no doubt. But what is the difference from the winemaking perspective, Nicolas, of these two wines and your personal opinion of them?
Okay. You know, in Bordeaux, we have classic vintages and classic vintages. And classic is, you have to give a definition of it. The classic vintage is something that can be usual. You know, it's a Bordeaux wine. You know, we can mention 2001, for instance, 2001, maybe 2008. And you have great classics. That means the vintages that will be the classic references of 82, 89, 96, 2005, and 2016 is one of them. It's a true great classic Bordeaux. 18 in its construction has been marked by a lot of rain the whole season until mid-July. Just don't know if you can remember the football World Cup final in Russia. It was in July 15th under showers. Well, I can remember it because we became world champions.
Yeah.
But in Bordeaux, we also had showers, the same. And the day after, not a single drop of rain. And it was the same until July 2019, almost. So finally, rain first, and then the drought until the last days of the harvest. And the style of the 2018 vintage has a lot to express about the flesh of the Merlot, lot of, yeah, the thickness of huge, powerful Merlot wines in balance with the precision of the tannic structure due to cab. And 16 and 18, the approach of the wine is, yeah, different. What we have experimented in 18 that we were not exactly sure about in 16, because once again, we used a new cuvée since 2013. Year after year, we better know how to use our new tool. It takes years. Why? Because we make one single vintage every 12 months. So once you try some different things in September 2014, the next trial is 12 months later. But it takes time before being able to use the new facilities perfectly. And in 18, I think we were more aware in terms of pump overs, duration of the pump overs, number of pump overs a day, and so on. So that's how we practice, and that's why it's very important once you decide to run an experience through the winemaking, to run it very precisely with a very very scientific rigor, yeah, to have some conclusions, and to get some results that you can apply the year after. And to me, the vintage that has been forgotten is 2017. To me, 2017 is the vintage at Pichon-Comtesse when we have better understood how to use it. I love 16. It's no doubt, it's a great vintage, and I mean the vintage is huge, and the wine is good. It's no doubt, but the same vintage, the same first matière, 1 year later, maybe we could have made it slightly better, slightly more precise. You know, it's a question of just a half or a quarter of a step, but because, and then since 17 and 18, we feel way better and at ease in our new cuvée. So, and that's probably why 18, 19, 20, I'm pretty sure we have something. We have something special in our hands, and that's why I'm so happy with those 3 vintages.
I mean, and I think it's fascinating if you're fortunate enough to try it even more extended vertical than we have done this evening. I certainly remember trying the 17 en primeur out at the Chateau, and it remains my wine of the vintage, the 17 Pichon. It was, for me, the best wine of that vintage. But what's interesting about the 18, trying it again this evening, is the precision that is there, because 18 is a vintage which I think made a number of very sensuous and rich and powerful wines, some of which subsequently out of barrel and in bottle, I don't think have quite the same precision or tension that a classic vintage or a great classic like 16 have. But I think your 18 does. I think your 18 has the voluptuous character, the sensuous character you expect but it's managed from the chateau, but it's also managed to keep the tension and the great structure and acidity there, which is impressive. So, yeah. I don't know what our guests think, or if anyone's got some comments in chat. They'd be interested to know thoughts on the 18 as well.
I'm very convinced that when you are tasting a wine, you should be able to locate it on a world map. And Bordeaux, and not only Bordeaux, the French wines and the wines made around the 45th parallel have to have this acidity, this drinkability that makes them unique. You know, it's our culture to make wine, to pair with food, and to drink it, and not to drink something like jam or I don't know what. It's not that it's better or worse. That's our culture. That's our taste.
It's just not Bordeaux. You're absolutely right. On the subject of the 16, and I will come back to the comment about the 2012 that was being left. But Michael just mentioned here, will the 2016 close down? You know, is the structure going to start gripping the fruit, or is it on an open and upward trajectory?
No, closing down, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, closing down. And to my perspective, it's very usual to have a wine, and on top, big wines are used to close down 3 or 4 years later. They are making and opening up 6 to 10 years later. So it's a period in the life of a wine between 3 and 10 years after the bottling or after the winemaking, when wines are closed down.
Okay. So Michael, whatever you've got left, pop it away for a few more years before getting those cases out. And then another vintage, which I always think is fascinating to comment on, was what do we think of the 2012 vintage, bought en primeur but not yet tried? When should those of us with cases in our cellar be knocking the tops off those?
2012, yeah, let's open it. Start to open it, and made for the next 15 years. No doubt. Very good Merlot. The cabs were a bit more tricky to make because we had some rain during the second part of the harvest. So even the best caps off were tricky to pick at the optimum ripeness. Well, great Merlot, the flesh and the power, the good attack and meat palate of the wine. And then, just try to open one bottle, and depends on your sensation in terms of tannic structure in the final mouth, but be patient or not.
Perfect. Nicolas, thank you so much. Now we're coming up to our allotted hour. Perhaps you wouldn't mind just finishing with a few more words about the 2020 vintage, because we're looking forward to heading into the en primeur campaign fairly shortly. Could you just give us a little bit more about 2020 specifically? Thank you.
Yeah, you know, we all have. We will all have memories about 2020 because of the global situation. And I can remember France was under the lockdown on March 17th last year. And at that time, buds started to break, and the foliage started to grow, and we really needed every workers to be tough and to be here to work hard. And it was all about anxiety, because we just didn't know nothing about what gonna happen. And 1 year later, it's easier, I must say. We are not that anxious because we know a bit more about facts. And but that was very, very special. And we never stopped working, because agriculture was one of those activities that we could not stop. And as a manager, it was a story of humankind, and taking guys with you and try to assure people that everything gonna be okay. And we created the good conditions to work in safely. And that was a lot of brainstorming and a lot of new conditions to adapt ourselves with. But finally, and on top of everything, you can add a huge and a strong, very strong pressure due to mildew, and such a campaign during which we had to protect the crop against diseases, and finally a very warm and dry summer. And at the end, what we do have in the glass is a good surprise, not to say a miracle. We will remember this 2020 first, because I think we have something great in the glass, I'm sure. So first, because we love it, and two, because it's all about a story of men and women all together. And that I must say, that's why I love my job. It's not only a job, it's a passion. And every year you have to make a new baby, create a new baby from scratch. And so it's all about taking care of people working with you, and in the vineyard, in the cellars. It's not only myself. I know I'm the one who's promoting the Pichon-Comtesse today and the wines, but we are something like 100 persons working for Pichon, and trying to do our best for having something decent in the glass. And I think 2020 is definitely decent.
Well, I have to say, I think you're doing a tremendous job, you and your team. I would like everyone to raise a glass if you have anything left, or if not, the empty flask.
Cheers, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you so much indeed for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah.